As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people. Surround us, Lord. Surround us, O Lord. We need to be in your presence. Surround us, Lord. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people. Surround us, Lord. Surround us, O Lord. We need to be in your presence. Surround us, Lord. Surround us, Lord. Surround us, O Lord. We need to be in your presence. Surround us, Lord. Surround us, Lord. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. My chains are gone, I've been set free. My God, my Savior, has ransomed me. And like a flood, his mercy reigns, unending love, amazing grace. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less taste to sing God's praise than when we first begun. My chains are gone, I've been set free. My God, my Savior, has ransomed me. And like a flood, his mercy reigns, unending love, amazing grace.
right, welcome back everyone to our study of Psalms as we continue this week with Psalm 5. We'll start, as we generally do, looking at the superscription. And as I mentioned at with the very first time we encountered one of these superscriptions were added later. They're kind of like titles of some of the New Testament books. They're not original to the text. So a lot of times they reflect, the traditional Jewish belief regarding authorship and circumstance and whatnot. So in Psalm 4, we noted, so the chief musician on Neganoth, generally believed to be stringed instruments. And I believe I mentioned last time when we discussed that there are quite a few ancient Hebrew words, the meanings of which are simply unknown. They're lost to time. So oftentimes, when I say, here's what this word is believed to mean, it's because it's the scholar's best guess. That word Selah that we saw in Psalm 3, S-E-L-A-H, you see in a number of Psalms is the same way. It's believed to be a word that indicates some type of a rest or a pause in reciting or singing the psalm. But who knows? It fits, certainly. I have no reason to think that isn't what it means, but it's again the scholar's educated guess. Here in Psalm 5, to the chief musician upon Nehiloth. Nehiloth, generally understood to be wind instruments. So slightly different there. You may just a slight difference in the word. It sounds very similar to what we saw before, but a bit different. And this one, like most Psalms, especially towards the beginning of the book, is attributed to David. Now, unlike Psalm 3, and again, what's generally believed to be the case at 4 as well, it doesn't specifically attribute this to David. During the time he was fleeing from Absalom, a lot of Psalms attributed to David specify authorship during Absalom's rebellion, or there are quite a few we'll come across attributed to the time when David was fleeing from Saul, when Saul sought to take his life. So it doesn't specify either of those, but as we're going to see, we get a little ways in here. It could definitely be either situation, because yet again, as with some of the Psalms we've already seen, we're only on number 5, but this one also deals with enemies who are plaguing the psalmist. And there's a bit, maybe a little more so than the other two, maybe so a bit more so than number 4 particularly, a bit of an imprecatory bent to this psalm. So you have different types of psalms. You have psalms of thanksgiving, ascension psalms, psalms that would have been sung or recited as worshipers made their way up the Temple Mount. Imprecatory psalms are another category, and these are psalms that tend to deal with the psalmist's petition to God to destroy his enemies. Now, the Psalm 5 is not entirely that, but there is a bit of that in it. So you can't help but note it as we make our way through. But we'll start by reading. And as I mentioned last week, I'm reading from the King James. Brother Waycaster, whose book I'm kind of pairing alongside it to help make some observations and kind of flesh out our class a bit. He uses the American Standard, so sometimes if you wonder why there's a difference, that's the reason why. Which is actually helpful, I think, because you kind of get those shades of meaning between the two, because sometimes they render it a bit differently, and one may be more precise than the other. One more thing that I'll note, because it comes up if I happen to read from Brother Waycaster's comments as opposed to what I have in front of me in the King James. I don't know if we've mentioned this before or not. I don't think we have. But if you're using the King James, you may see on occasion the word Lord in all caps. Sometimes in the Old Testament you find Lord in all caps. Sometimes you find it just in lowercase letters as a regular word. If you see Lord just as a regular word, it's in lowercase or it's capitalized at the beginning of a sentence, it's the word Adonai, which is just a generic term for Lord. You have regular people being referred to that way. And you think of kind of like think of Great Britain, right? Lords and ladies, It's just a general honorific. It isn't specific to God. If you see Lord in all caps, it's actually Yahweh, or at least which is the proper name of God, one of them. It's 4 letters, transliterated into English, YHWH. Of course, it's actually 4 Hebrew letters, but it's also generally sometimes transliterated, as in the case of the ASV, as Jehovah. In the ASV, it actually says Jehovah. It actually uses the word rather than putting it as Lord in all caps. Why is that? It's because it goes back to German scholars in the 17th and 18th century. J in German is pronounced like a Y. So you think in German, yes is Ja. It's spelled J-A. The J is pronounced as a Y. So it's a Y. But in German, it would have started with a J, right? Because J makes the Y sound. So in English, you read it in English, it's Jehovah. It would be Yahuwah in German, Yahovah, which again is a guess, because also, as another fun fact, before we actually get into Psalm 5, there are no vowels in Hebrew, in ancient Hebrew at least. I don't know about modern Hebrew. It's all consonants. Some later Hebrew will have marks on the letters to indicate the vowel pronunciation to provide. I said a moment ago, the Yahweh, the name of God, the Tetragrammaton, is YHWH, transliterated into English, and no vowels. So what vowels actually go there? That ah and a that's provided. Again, just like some of these other words we noted in Psalms, it is a best guess. The answer is no one really knows exactly how to pronounce it, because the vowels aren't there in the original text, and the traditional pronunciation comes much later. But anyway, you may notice that. So let's read through Psalm 5, and then we'll come back and note some things regarding it. Give ear to my words, O Lord, consider my meditation. Hearken unto the voice of my cry, my King and my God, for unto thee will I pray. My voice shalt thou hear in the morning, O Lord. In the morning will I direct my prayer unto thee, and will look up. For thou art not a God that hath pleasure in wickedness, neither shall evil dwell with thee. The foolish shall not stand in thy sight. Thou hatest all workers of iniquity. Thou shalt destroy them that speak leasing. Now, the ASV has lies there, which I think probably makes a bit more sense to a modern English speaker. Speak lies. The Lord will abhor the bloody and deceitful man. You may hear the trash truck. Pardon that. It's Thursday afternoon. But as for me, I will come into my house, into thy house, in the multitude of thy mercy, and in thy fear will I worship toward thy holy temple. Lead me, O Lord, in thy righteousness because of mine enemies. Make thy way straight before my face. For there is no faithfulness in their mouth. Their inward part is very wickedness. Their throat is an open sepulchre. They flatter with their tongue. Destroy thou them, O God. Again, a bit of that imprecatory event we talked about earlier. Now let them fall by their own counsels. Cast them out in the multitude of their transgressions, for they have rebelled against thee. But let all those that put their trust in thee rejoice. Let them ever shout for joy, because thou defendest them. Let them also that love thy name be joyful in thee. For thou, Lord, wilt bless the righteous. With favor wilt thou compass him as with a shield. Okay, so if we want to kind of break this psalm down, I think this one, as you're going through, it's fairly easy to see kind of the train of thought here, but Brother Waycaster has a handily alliterated outline that you can use. The first 3 verses, we have David's appeal. Okay, and more specifically, in the first 2, we have his plea to God, his plea that God will listen to his prayer. We note his consistency in making these appeals. Right, this is not, well, we'll come to it in a minute as we go through in more detail. Verses 4 through 8, we have David's assessment. In verses 4 through 6, God's opposition to the wicked is set forth, so he's noting how God's disposition toward the unrighteous. And then 7 and 8, God's favor toward the righteous. So he draws a contrast between the two. Verses 9 through 10, adversaries, their foulness in verse 9, and their fate in verse 10. And then the final two verses, 11 and 12, his assurance, encouragement to others, verse 11, and affirmation of these things in verse 12. So going back, noting the appeal that's made at the beginning of this psalm in verses 1 through 3. He starts out asking for God to hear him, the ASV, to give ear to his words. You literally picture God, cupping his hand to his ear and in order to hear better. And there's it somewhat includes a clear expectation on David's part that God will answer. There's certainly a boldness on David's part to approach God. As Christians, we're likewise instructed to do. Hebrews 4:16, right? We come before God and make our prayers known with boldness. We found that here with David. And it's worth noting, he says, give ear to my words, hear my words. Prayer consists of just that. Words, thoughts. Words have much more power than I think people are sometimes want to acknowledge. Give ear to my words, consider my meditation. So he's asking God to consider his innermost thoughts, the groanings, the yearnings of his heart. And I think there's an idea here that's similar to what we find in Romans 8:26 and 27. This notion that while his words are sincere and truthful, they yet somewhat fall short in expressing all of his meaning. That there are depths and desires of the soul that language simply cannot convey. Again, you find a bit of that in Romans 8 as well, and I think that's similar to the idea that we find here. Right? Consider the words, but consider also the meditation. Right? So he's asking God to consider what it is that he's conveying by language, what he's purposed in his mind, what he's making known, but then also the deeper essence that behind that. Note that the prayer is personal. My meditation, my cry, my voice, my prayer. This is personal. David is communicating with God one-on-one. And certainly, we pray in a worship setting. One person may offer prayer on behalf of others, on behalf of fellow brethren. We do that in our worship setting in church. I can think of examples from the Old Testament. You have Daniel and Jeremiah offering prayer on behalf of their fellow Israelites. So that certainly happens. You find Jesus doing the very same thing in the New Testament. But there's also the individual responsibility for prayer. So we have here an earnest appeal, a cry for help from a troubled soul. Yet again, as we saw in the previous two Psalms, a soul that is beset by enemies, a regular refrain in many of these Psalms attributed to David. He notes that God is his king, his God, and it's certainly because of that David appeals to him, and because of that he can expect an answer to these prayers. Note verse 3, the persistence behind this. My voice shalt thou hear in the morning. In the morning will I direct up my prayer unto thee, and will look up. This is something that's purposeful. it's something that's planned. I think about Daniel. You recall what got Daniel in so much trouble after the king had proclaimed, no one can pray, no one can worship to any god except for him. You remember his counselors had set this law up as a trap for Daniel. So of course Daniel went right to his window in plain view of the public and prayed as he was wont to do. I think of that because you get this understanding that this was a regular thing for Daniel. It was purposeful, it was planned, and you find a similar thing here in Psalm 5:3. Right? This is something that David does regularly in the morning. He's looking to a new day, making his intentions and thoughts known to God. Okay, verses 4 through 8. The psalmist writes, verses 4 through 6, God's opposition to the wicked. Verses 7 and 8, God's favor toward the righteous. And here, you get a bit of Psalm 1, do you not? You find the same kind of a comparison drawn there between the wicked and the righteous. And certainly, as was the case when we were discussing Psalm 1, it's worth noting that there is those two classes of people. There are the righteous, those who, like David, seek after God, wish to know and to do God's will. And then there are others, the workers of iniquity, the foolish, those who could care less. They're going about doing what they want to do, setting themselves in opposition to God and His will. You find the same contrast drawn here. Okay, verse 5. The foolish. The ASV renders it as the arrogant. The foolish shall not stand in thy sight. I'm reminded of Judges. In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. 1 Corinthians, right? 1 Corinthians 1, Paul draws a distinction between the wisdom of God and the foolishness of man. Man thinks he's wiser, but certainly isn't. He discusses the gospel, the power that it has, and how the power of the gospel to save, and man's viewing it as something that is foolish, when in fact it certainly is not. So here in Psalm 5, the foolish shall not stand in thy sight. Right? Those who certainly think they know better. Again, the ASV renders it arrogant. Perfect word to capture the idea here. So these are men who were setting themselves against God, and certainly against David as well. You will destroy them that speak lies. Again, leasing in the King James, lies, I think, certainly fits better today. And it's interesting to note, Brother Waycaster notes this. So oftentimes you have sin and iniquity mentioned in a general sense, right? You find this throughout Scripture, Old Testament and New. But often, no, not always, but oftentimes when sin is specified, right, when you get into something specific beyond just sin in a general sense, it is often an abuse of the tongue that appears. Or I should say it's most often abuse of the tongue that appears. So if you're going to get more specific than just sin, it often comes down to something like we find here. Thou shalt destroy them that speak lies. In fact, in the very next phrase, the bloody and the deceitful man, right? So deceit, going right along with that. So often it's the case. And that's not necessarily to say that a sin of the tongue, right, like lying, gossip, slandering, that these things are necessarily, worse or any less serious than other sins. But I would suggest, take it with a grain of salt, that the frequency with which you see such things mentioned, again, when you get any more specific than sin in a general sense, may have something to do with the greater frequency and prevalence of that type of sin in the world. The Lord abhorreth, Jehovah abhorreth in the ASV. God's reaction to sin, He absolutely hates it. He abhors it. He will punish it. Again, God's disposition towards the foolish, those who speak lies, those who are bloody and deceitful. Verse 7, the writer turns his attention to the treatment of those who are righteous. Unlike the wicked, right, the foolish, the speaker of lies, workers of iniquity, the ones whom the Lord absolutely abhors, the ones who will be destroyed, those who are bloody and deceitful. I mean, how many negative terms can you cram into two sentences? You get a very distinct picture drawn there. But in verse 7, he flips and looks at the righteous, unlike the wicked, who are going to be destroyed. And David avows that he would come into thy house and fear and reverence, worship God in the holy temple. Right, house is synonymous with temple. Two observations worthy of note. The temple was not built during David's lifetime, right? Of course, that David purchased the property on which the temple would be constructed and helped to do some of the preliminary prerequisite work that his son Solomon would ultimately take out. But Solomon was the one who actually built the temple. David was told that he was too bloody a man. He had too much blood on his hands to do it. So it was not built during David's lifetime, but the tabernacle was sometimes referred to as such. Joshua 6:24, 1 Samuel 1:9, 3:3, 2 Samuel 12:20. And also, secondly, David, not being a priest, would not be allowed to enter into the holy place or the most holy place. So his words here likely mean that he would enter the temple through God's divinely appointed medium, the priest. Right? So perhaps a bit of accommodative language on the part of David, but still he's able to approach in that way. So in verse 8, having heard the fact of prayer, we now learn the contents of that prayer. Lead me, O Lord, in thy righteousness because of mine enemies. Make thy way straight before my face. Okay, so up to this point in the psalm, we know that he's praying. But it isn't clear what's the occasion for this prayer. What is it that he's praying about? Because in the first three verses, we have his appeal, in verse 3, and regarding his consistency, his regularity of prayer. We've seen certainly God's or the psalmist's reflection on God's disposition toward the wicked and the unrighteous. Verse 7, contrasting with that, the righteous. But it isn't until verse 8 that we really come to see what it is that this prayer is about. And yet again, as we already noted, similar to Psalm 3 and 4, the occasion here has to do with enemies who are plaguing David. Again, that could fit any number of occasions in David's life. The superscription doesn't attribute it to any one of them. But in verses 9 through 10, we have these thoughts concerning his adversaries. There is no faithfulness in their mouth. Their inward part is very wickedness. Their throat is an open sepulchre. They flatter with their tongue. And then in verse 10 we have the imprecatory thought. But yet again, I want to contrast this with what we saw earlier, verses 4, 5, and 6. How negative, number one, how negative can it be, right? There's no faithfulness in their mouth. They're liars. Their inward part is very wickedness, right? They're wicked, rotten to the core. Their throat is an open sepulcher. You think about an open tomb, the foulness, the rottenness that issues forth is the picture that's drawn for what comes out of their mouth. They flatter with their tongue. It's kind of like in verse 6, we noted the fact that he's mentioning sin more specifically. It has to do with the sin of the tongue, right? They speak lies. Yet again, here we go in verse 9, the very same thing 4 times over. I'll make the point yet again. How prevalent how prevalent are sins of the tongue? Lying, slandering, gossiping, deceiving. You can't help but note the prevalence of it in Scripture in general and in this psalm in particular. So, the imprecatory thought here in verse 10, destroy thou them, O God. Some psalms are far more certainly emotional. I don't know that graphic is quite the right word I'm looking for here, but sometimes the psalmist gets a little more specific. Not only with the fact that he wants them to be destroyed, but specifically how he wants God to destroy them. So you have a little bit of that kind of an imprecatory thought here, but again, not to the extent that some other psalms have it. And some psalms are entirely, the whole psalm is this kind of a thought. But here you get a taste of it. Destroy thou them, O God, let them fall by their own counsels, right? Which kind of leads back to verse 5, the foolish, the arrogant. They think they know better. They think they're wise. They think they know better than God, but they don't. And so, destroy them, let them fall by their own counsels. Cast them out in the multitude of their transgressions, for they have rebelled against thee. It reminds me of the saying, if you have someone who's in the wrong, as clearly these people are, they've rebelled against God. Their own counsel that they're going by is inherently flawed. They have a multitude of transgressions in which the psalmist wants them to be cast down. The saying goes, if you have someone who's in the wrong, if you give him enough rope, he'll hang himself, right? If you just kind of sit back and let them go down the ill-advised path that they're on, even if it seems like they may be headed in the right direction now, ultimately they're going to end up causing their own downfall. And that seems to be the exact thought that you have here in verse 10. Destroy thou them, O God, let them fall by their own counsels, cast them out in the multitude of their transgressions, for they've rebelled against thee. And I find this somewhat interesting. To me, there seems to be a bit of a contrast there. It's like on the one hand, he understands they're going to fall all on their own, right? They're listening to their own counsel. It's in opposition to God. It's bound. It can't help but end in anything but total failure. They're headed that way. So on the one hand, let them, again, as the saying goes, let them hang themselves by their own rope. But then he turns around and says, cast them out in the multitude of their transgressions, for they've rebelled against thee. Hold them guilty is how the ASV renders it. So they're leading to their own destruction. But even so, even though they're ultimately going to fall by their own counsels, God is yet going to hold them guilty. God is yet going to cast them down. Again, the psalmist says, destroy thou them, O God. It's like they're going to destroy themselves. But even so, there's still a price to be paid for the iniquity, for the transgressions. All right, verses 11 and 12, closing out the psalm. The psalmist's assurance. So these last two verses set forth the great assurance the psalmist has in God, God's ability to deliver. Verse 11, David offers encouragement to others, and finishes out in verse 12, affirming these things to be true. Okay, so Psalm 5, really quite similar to the two that came before it. Seemingly a similar circumstance. Again, as we discussed, a bit of the imprecatory thought. Similar to Psalm 1, the contrast between the righteous and the unrighteous. Things that we'll find in many more Psalms to come. But I think the big lessons to take from this one. Number one, how marvelous is the power of prayer. You might know James 5:16, right? The fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. So certainly there's power in it. David recognizes that. The psalmist recognizes that. But then also, as we noted near the beginning in the first couple of verses, the personal nature of this. And the fact, as we noted in verse 3, that this is a regular part of David's life. It's something that he evidently does frequently. He's purposed in his heart. He set aside a particular time to do this. And as such, he's certainly no stranger to God as he comes forward and makes an appeal in time of trouble. All right, so that is Psalm 5. Lord willing, next week we will continue on and take a look at Psalm 6. Thank you very much.
Over all the earth you reign on high, every mountain stream, every sunset sky But my one request, Lord, my only aim, is that you'd reign in me again. Lord, reign in me, reign in your power over all my dreams. In my darkest hour, you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again? Over every thought, over every word, may my life reflect the beauty of my Lord. 'Cause you mean more to me than any earthly thing. So won't you reign in me again? Lord, reign in me, reign in your power over all my dreams. In my darkest hour, you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again? Lord, reign in me, reign in your power over all my dreams. In my darkest hour, you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again? You are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in